Subscribe before the evidence gets scrubbed clean. Like, comment, and don't blink, because the truth is already trying to disappear. The siren had the lonely cry of a town that still expected nights to be quiet. It was just past 4 in the morning in New Haven, Indiana, the hour when even the bars stop arguing with themselves, when dispatch crackled with a frantic voice and 2 officers punched their cruisers through the dark. The neighborhood slept behind curtained windows as blue and red lights smeared across vinyl siding and clipped hedges. At the end of a short street, a woman stood in a yard, barefoot in the dew, arms cutting the night like blades, waving them down. Her name was Allison Davis. She pointed them through the kitchen, past the white light of a television that had never learned how to sleep, to a front doorway where a man lay face down, motionless. The floor below his head had a spreading stain that stole the color right out of the room. His name was Kevin. Married, 40 years old, worked with his hands and his back in a landscaper's stubborn pride. Summoned from oblivion to the center of everything, the paramedics bent to him with practiced speed, while an officer asked the question everyone asks on instinct. Had she talked to him, touched him, begged for something like a miracle? Not that he saw. The partners exchanged a look that said they had been in living rooms like this before and knew how quickly a story can harden. Outside, a helicopter chopped the night into pieces as an officer delivered the kind of update that rearranges a family's future. Critical, extremely critical. He told Allison she couldn't go back inside. She nodded, half laugh, half breath, the sound people make when their body is trying to negotiate with shock. She said they had been out, that they were regulars at a place called East Haven Tavern, a bar where bartenders know your drink and your bad days. She said when they got home, she took the couch. There was a pillow and a blanket to prove it. The TV hummed a late-night show's polite laughter. On a nearby surface, beer cans stood in a straight line like a little parade that had lost its way. Everything, at a glance, looked ordinary, until it didn't. Detective James Kruger was pulled from sleep at 5, dressed in the gray of pre-dawn, and followed the siren's echo to the house. He logged the details the way detectives do: the narrow stairs, the sharp turn at the bottom, the open door, the position of the body, the absence of obvious lacerations. Falls happen, they happen badly. He took in the scene and felt it resolve into a simple narrative. The girlfriend of accidents is relief, and relief can be dangerous. He released the house. It seemed humane in the moment. Let the wife get clothes. Let the family do what families do when hospitals become waiting rooms for fate. Though later, he would wish he hadn't. At Parkview Regional Medical Center, fluorescent light gave everything the pallor of winter. Allison's best friend, Casey, arrived on a ringing phone and muscle memory, bracing for impact. She found Allison folded in on herself, eyes raw, words running ahead of breath. They say he's brain dead. People say brain dead in hospitals with a kind of reverence, as if saying it correctly might persuade the word to change shape. Family and friends came in a tide. Bar regulars who had laughed with Kevin hours earlier, co-workers, the kind of loyal people small towns make and keep. They all hit the wall of the same sentence: organ donor, life support, soon. Back at the house, the detective's decision unfurled its consequences. The scene was no longer a scene, it was a home again. Someone had to clean. No one ever thinks about that part. The towels, the bucket, the impossible geometry of a stain. Allison's father did what fathers do. He rolled up his sleeves and tried to give his daughter a world he recognized. Upstairs, behind a closed door, a pit bull named Willow paced and whined, the dog's anxiety a metronome for the morning. They had no children. The dog was their child. Every detail wobbled under the weight of too much meaning. In the hours that followed the first story, the fall, the stairs, the beer, the couch, held. It held at the tavern, too. People remembered Kevin, animated and loud in the way some men are. opinionated enough to be a presence, generous enough to be forgiven for it. Allison arrived after her shift at a retail store, the kind of job that coats your smile on polite. They drank, they joked, they left after midnight. A friend texted with Kevin at 1:11 a.m., the kind of buzzed banter that men trade at that hour. At one point, Kevin typed a small sigh of a message about the wife, and the words, "ordinary then," would later be picked up, turned in the light, and examined like a shard of glass. A doctor at Parkview looked at the scans and felt her stomach go cold. There were fractures, multiple, on the left, on the back, and bleeding that didn't sit comfortably with the idea of a simple tumble. She did what conscience tells you to do. She called it in. The coroner ordered an autopsy. The story that had felt so stable began to shift, its weight moving underfoot. When the autopsy landed on a desk 3 days later, it landed like a gavel. The skull wasn't bruised by a single mistake. It was crushed in. The words were clinical and devastating. They were not consistent with a fall down those stairs, not the way you imagine it, feet missing a step, body turning, head catching a post, not like that. The detective read the lines once, twice, and felt a flush of anger, the kind you reserve for yourself. He had released the scene. He had let the tide of family and grief wash through and erase the edges where truth loves to hide. Police went back with a warrant, body cams on, hope narrowed to specifics, a weapon that could have done this, traces that hadn't been wiped away by good intentions and bleach. But the house had been straightened in the quiet, dutiful way people straighten when they're trying to feel useful. The bottom of the stairs still looked like the bottom of the stairs. The post at the turn was clean. Too clean, said some. Exactly as expected, said others, because not all catastrophic injuries are messy on the outside. Either way, certainty kept its distance. The narrative split along the fault line that runs through every investigation, accident or intent. The detective's eye, now sharpened by the autopsy, went back to the stills. He didn't like the way Kevin lay, flat, almost framed. When bodies fall, they tend to jam into corners, to twist at bad angles, to tell you with their geometry what happened. This looked placed. He thought about the ambulance ride. Allison hadn't tried to climb in. He thought about the laughter the body cameras picked up at the margins of conversation with paramedics, that fragile, terrible laugh grief sometimes borrows. He thought about the 911 call and how the dispatchers always repeat the same phrase, "Tell me exactly what happened," and how some people answer it like a script. He felt the tug of a story that tilted toward violence. The town did what towns do. It divided itself. At the tavern, people swore by Allison's kindness, her loyalty, the way she made everyone feel like they mattered. Others shook their heads and said there are things you don't see, that couples who dance in their kitchen can also keep score when no one's watching. The investigators dug into phones. They read the late messages, the kind of small annoyance between spouses who are tired and tipsy. Jason, the friend, insisted the texts were jokes, the kind of ribbing men trade at that hour. The detective saw frustration in the emojis. Days turned into weeks. The house kept giving and withholding in equal measure. The upstairs bedroom with the dog had been avoided the first morning. Now it loomed like a missed exit. The defense, when it eventually formed, would say there was never a weapon to find because there was never a murder. They would say a single impact on the bottom banister post could splinter a skull, that the brain could bounce against its bone and tear from within. The prosecution would point to absence, no hair, no tissue on the post, and shape absence into argument. Two truths, both tidy, could not both be right. In the middle of this push and pull stood a woman who had gone to sleep a wife and woken up a widow, and a man who left a bar laughing and arrived on a floor silent. Friends spoke about organ donation with trembling pride. Parents of grown children tried to remember how to be useful. A town with one courthouse rehearsed in whispers what a trial might sound like. The investigator, promoted but restless, replayed decisions in his head like some people replay songs when they're not sure what they missed.
The case took a breath and then tightened. After 2 months of collecting, comparing, and convincing, the police labeled Kevin's death a homicide and named Allison Davis as the suspect. A warrant followed. The headlines did what headlines do. They flattened grief into type. Allison turned herself in 3 days before Christmas, walking into a steel door with her parents beside her, a small procession through a winter that had nothing to do with weather. Her lawyers moved quickly. Her best friend held on to the phone and to hope. Her father clung to faith like a lifeline. In all that noise, the investigation found a quiet, almost offhand detail that refused to shrink. It was that text, the one sent at 2:31 a.m., the one Jason insisted meant nothing. It read like a shrug. It read like a warning. It read like domestic shorthand so ordinary you could ignore it forever, unless someone died. They pulled the message back up on a screen, the blue bubble glowing in the dim of an evidence room. Investigators stared at it the way people stare at a locked door, wondering what waits on the other side. Because whatever the autopsy had revealed, and whatever the cleaned floors had erased, that casual line, those 4 careless words, wasn't casual anymore. It was a key. They didn't yet know which lock it would fit. They only knew this. When they finally opened the autopsy file and matched its fractures to the household geometry, that text, "Gotta go, the wife," stopped being a joke and started pointing toward a motive no one wanted to believe.
The morning after Kevin Davis's funeral, frost clung to the sidewalks of New Haven like a film of ash. The air was brittle, the kind that bites when you breathe. In that cold silence, Detective James Kruger stood outside the Davis house again, this time not as a responder, but as a man, retracing the footprints of his own mistake. The front steps creaked beneath his boots. The yellow tape had long been peeled away, replaced by the faint smell of detergent and something else, memory. Inside, the house looked too clean, floors scrubbed, counters polished, the kind of clean that doesn't comfort, but warns. Kruger's flashlight beam caught a streak on the baseboard, a whisper of what once was there. "We erased our own crime scene," he muttered to himself. The words hung heavy, as if the walls were listening. 3 days earlier, the coroner's report had shifted everything. Crushed skull, multiple fractures, no external laceration consistent with fall. The phrasing was sterile, but the meaning was sharp. Someone had hit Kevin Davis, hard, and more than once. Kruger replayed that first night in his head, the sirens, Allison's trembling hands, her flat voice. He remembered how she laughed once, the strangest, smallest laugh, when a paramedic tried to calm her down. Back then it had felt like a symptom of shock. Now it felt like an echo of guilt. When the second warrant came through, Kruger brought his team back. The house was quiet, except for the low growl of the family pit bull, Willow, trapped upstairs during the cleanup. The detective had never checked that room the first time. He told himself he didn't want to startle the animal. Truth was, he didn't want to startle what he might find. The door creaked open. Willow whined, tail tucked. The room smelled of stale air and anxiety. Kruger's flashlight swept across the carpet. No blood, no weapon, no sign of struggle. The banister below was still intact, the post smooth and polished. He knelt beside it, fingers grazing the edge where Kevin's skull was said to have struck. There was no trace of impact, no blood, no hair, nothing. If Kevin had fallen, the post should have remembered. It didn't. Downstairs, technicians scanned, swabbed, and photographed. Every creak of the house became a question. every silence a possibility. When they finally left, Kruger stood at the threshold one last time and whispered, "We let the truth slip through the cracks." At Parkview Hospital, a young doctor named Rachel Handley couldn't shake the case either. She had been the one to flag Kevin's injuries as suspicious. She'd seen hundreds of falls, drunks, accidents, the occasional domestic scuffle, but never anything like this. Multiple impact zones, skull caved inward, no abrasions, no external bleeding. It was violence hidden beneath skin. Her report triggered a chain reaction. Coroner, police, prosecutor. By week's end, Kevin's death certificate had a new line. Cause of death, homicide. For Allison Davis, the world was collapsing in slow motion. Her husband was gone, her home had turned into evidence, and whispers had begun to bloom in town like weeds. At Parkview Tavern, regulars debated over beer and disbelief. "She couldn't have done that," said Jody, one of the bartenders. "She loved him. You could see it." Across the counter, a man stirred his drink and didn't look up. "You ever really know what happens when people go home?" he asked. The question didn't need an answer. It just sat there, bitter as whiskey. Allison spent her nights replaying everything. Kevin's laugh at the bar, the fight before bed, the sound of him stumbling upstairs, the way the silence after the thud seemed to stretch forever. She told herself he had fallen. She told everyone he had fallen. But when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the dull, solid sound that didn't belong to a fall. It belonged to a blow. Her phone had been confiscated, her messages under scrutiny. Investigators combed through her digital life, looking for motive, resentment, anger, jealousy. What they found instead was noise. Photos of vacations, grocery lists, affectionate texts. Normal life, too normal, until they reached the early hours of August 12th. The messages between Kevin and his friend Jason Young were short and harmless on the surface. Banter about drinking, jokes about being married life tired. But one line stood out. At 2:31 a.m., Kevin wrote, "Gotta go. The wife." It was nothing. It was everything. To Kruger, those words looked like the last sign of a man still alive, the last line before a fight turned fatal. By September, Allison was officially labeled a person of interest. Reporters began sniffing around the story. Headlines whispered, "Suburban wife turned killer." The small police department felt the heat. Kruger's promotion to chief didn't dull his obsession. He needed the case to make sense, to balance the ledger of his earlier mistake. At his desk, he lined up the evidence photos, the staircase, the floor, the post, the body. He stared until the images blurred into something abstract, shapes and shadows. The position of Kevin's body still gnawed at him. He wasn't wedged or twisted the way most falls leave a body. He was laid out flat, arms at his sides, as though placed there. And then there was the phone call. The 911 recording was clinical until it wasn't. Allison's voice trembled in all the right places, but her words were too measured, too careful. She never said, "Hurry." She never pleaded. She described. The dispatchers said she sounded rehearsed. Kruger played it again and again. "There's blood. He fell. Please send someone." The cadence was off, detached, like someone remembering lines rather than living them. The prosecutor, Tisa Helge, took interest. She was calm, methodical, the kind of lawyer who could turn chaos into structure. She met with Kruger, reviewed the photos, and circled one fact in red. Multiple skull fractures. No external wound. "That's not a staircase fall," she said flatly. "That's blunt force trauma." Meanwhile, Allison clung to what was left of her life, her dog, her faith, and the friends who still believed in her. But even they began to change. People avoided her at the grocery store. The mailman didn't linger.
Her parents kept the blinds drawn. Then came the warrant. 4 months after Kevin's death, officers arrived with papers and cameras. The knock on her door sounded like a sentence. She didn't fight, she didn't cry, she just nodded as they cuffed her, turned to her parents, and said quietly, "Take care of Willow." At the station, under harsh fluorescent light, Allison signed her name on a stack of forms that all meant the same thing. She was accused of murder. Her mugshot looked almost serene, the calm of someone who still believed the truth would save her. The next morning, her name was everywhere. Local woman charged in her husband's death. Police call it a domestic homicide. The town that once toasted her and Kevin now whispered about motive, money, jealousy, rage. None of it fit cleanly, but rumor never needs precision. In the evidence room, Kruger held one last unanswered question in his hand: the lack of a weapon. If Allison had beaten Kevin, with what? The house offered no clues. The cleanup erased too much. Every swing of imagination came back empty.
Then, someone on his team said quietly, "What if there wasn't one?" Kruger frowned. "You're saying she used nothing? He hit something? The post, maybe?" For a moment, the air in the room shifted. If Kevin had truly fallen, the angle, the impact, the shape of the wound, it might line up after all. The thought was blasphemy to the investigation, but it refused to go away. Kruger slammed the file shut. "We'll let the court sort that out." Christmas week, 2023. Allison Davis, 33 years old, walked into Allen County Jail with her parents beside her. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, her breath fogging in the cold air. She said her name softly to the booking officer. The cuffs clicked. Outside, the snow began to fall, covering the last footprints leading up to the jailhouse door. Inside, the system closed around her. Her friends said she was innocent. The police said she was a killer. And somewhere between those two versions of Allison Davis lay the truth. Waiting, patient, and buried under the kind of silence only the dead can keep. Because as the trial approached, one thing became clear. The evidence didn't agree on what happened that night. But someone, somewhere, knew exactly how Kevin Davis had died. And when that truth finally surfaced, it would destroy more than just one marriage.
The courthouse in Fort Wayne, Indiana, rose like an old monument to certainty. Columns, marble floors, echoes that turned whispers into accusations. On May 6, 2025, under a gray Midwestern sky, Allison Davis walked up those steps in shackles. 17 months behind bars had turned her skin pale and her eyes wary, but her posture remained upright, calm, controlled, as if she'd spent those months rehearsing for this moment. Inside, seats filled with faces that had already chosen sides. On one bench sat Kevin's mother, hands folded, jaw set in quiet grief. Across the aisle, Allison's parents leaned forward, their faith trembling but intact. Between them, lawyers, reporters, sketch artists. No cameras allowed, but everyone knew this trial would live forever in digital retellings, podcast episodes, and late-night debates. Detective James Kruger took his place near the prosecution table. He had been promoted to police chief since the investigation, but the weight of this case hadn't lifted. It clung to him like a badge he couldn't take off. He knew what was at stake. If Allison walked free, it would mean that somewhere along the line, his instincts, and maybe his integrity, had been wrong. The prosecution's opening statement was sharp, deliberate, and cold. This was not an accident. This was a killing, planned in anger, executed in silence, and disguised as tragedy. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. She painted the picture of a fractured marriage, arguments behind closed doors, financial stress, and a night of heavy drinking that turned into something final. She told them about the fractures in Kevin's skull, the suspicious 911 call, and the way Allison never once screamed for help. Every word was a nail in a coffin the jury was being asked to build. When it was the defense's turn, attorney Andrew Baldwin stood with quiet conviction. "This case," he began, "is built on assumption. It's built on a detective's guilt over a mistake and a town's need for someone to blame." He pointed to the empty space in the photos, the missing weapon, the spotless post at the bottom of the stairs, the complete lack of external wounds. Ladies and gentlemen, if Allison Davis truly beat her husband to death, where's the evidence of that violence? No hair, no blood, no fingerprints on any object. The simplest explanation is often the truest. Kevin fell. He let that word hang. Fell, like gravity itself was his co-counsel. The trial unfolded like a slow-burning film, each witness adding a new shade to the picture. Dr. Bill Smock, for the prosecution, walked the jury through CT scans and medical jargon, his pointer tracing lines on Kevin's fractured skull. "Multiple impact zones," he said. "Left temporal, occipital, parietal. These are not consistent with a single fall. This is a pattern of blunt force trauma, repeated, deliberate, fatal." The courtroom fell still. Every syllable sounded like a verdict. Then came Dr. L.J. Dragovich for the defense, a veteran forensic pathologist with the calm demeanor of a man used to staring death in the eye. He called up the same scans but saw something differently. One impact, one catastrophic fall. The bone fragments you see, secondary fractures from the skull collapsing inward. No defensive wounds, no bruising on the hands, no external trauma. This was an accident misread as a murder. The jurors leaned forward. Two experts, one body, two stories, each scientifically sound, each incompatible with the other. Kruger watched from the gallery, jaw tight. He'd been sure for months that Allison did it. He'd seen the body, heard the laughter on the body cam, felt something off in her stillness. But now Dragovich's logic gnawed at the edges of his certainty. What if he'd been chasing a ghost of his own regret? He pushed the thought away. The prosecution showed the 911 recording next. Allison's voice filled the room, steady, calm, almost distant. "My husband fell. There's blood. Please send someone." Helge froze the audio. "Notice what's missing," she said. "No urgency, no panic, no cry for help. She performs concern. She doesn't feel it." In the gallery, someone shifted uncomfortably. Then came the footage, the body cam from the first responders. Allison standing in the yard, arms wrapped around her, the faint sound of her laughing with paramedics. It lasted only a few seconds, but it hit like static, unnatural, eerie, unforgettable. The defense countered with an explanation: trauma. People react to shock in strange ways. Some scream, some collapse, some laugh. It wasn't guilt, they said. It was human confusion caught on camera. The trial moved to its physical centerpiece, the staircase. Both sides had brought in experts, measurements, diagrams, but nothing compared to the jury's field trip. They were escorted to the Davis home, the air thick with silence. The banister loomed at the bottom of the stairs, smooth, unmarked. "This," Baldwin told them quietly, "is the supposed murder weapon, clean as the day it was installed." Helge, standing nearby, didn't flinch. "Because she wiped it clean," she said simply. That single exchange captured the entire case. Everything depended on interpretation.
The evidence didn't speak. It whispered, and everyone heard something different. By the fourth day, closing arguments arrived like thunder rolling in. Helge stood before the jury, eyes sharp. Kevin Davis didn't fall. He was struck, he was moved, and the woman who called for help already knew he was beyond saving. The laughter, the contradictions, the calm, those are not the marks of a grieving wife. They're the echoes of a guilty one. Baldwin rose next, his tone softer, more intimate. You've heard two stories, one built on assumption, one on evidence. The state wants you to believe Allison Davis somehow killed a man twice her size, dragged him across the floor, cleaned the scene spotless, and invented a story, all while traumatized and intoxicated. They want you to ignore the simplest truth. Accidents happen, and sometimes when they happen, they look ugly. He turned, eyes meeting the jurors one by one. Reasonable doubt isn't a loophole. It's the guardrail that keeps innocent people from being buried by mistakes. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into night. The courthouse emptied, lights dimmed, and Kruger sat alone in the corridor, head bowed. He knew every piece of evidence, every photo by heart. He also knew how fallible people could be. Maybe the worst crimes weren't acts of malice, but failures of certainty. At 11 p.m., a deputy opened the courtroom door. "We have a verdict." Everyone filed in. Allison's hands trembled for the first time since the arrest. The air was electric, the kind of silence that hums. The foreperson stood. "On the charge of murder in first degree, we find the defendant—" A pause, so long you could feel the weight of every heartbeat. "Not guilty." The sound that followed wasn't celebration, it was release. A gasp, a cry, a sob breaking loose from somewhere deep. Allison's mother clutched her hands to her mouth. Her father wept openly. Across the aisle, Kevin's mother sat still, eyes glassy but calm. "He's still my son," she said quietly, "and she's still my daughter-in-law." Outside, the cold bit harder than ever, but people waited anyway. At 2:15 a.m., Allison stepped out of Allen County Jail, coat buttoned, eyes wide at the flash of cameras. The crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, disbelief. Her friend Casey rushed forward and hugged her so tightly it looked like rescue. For the police, the verdict felt like a bruise under the badge. Kruger faced reporters and said, "We did our job. The jury did theirs." But that night, alone in his car, he couldn't shake one image. Kevin's body on the floor, perfectly still, perfectly arranged.
At East Haven Tavern, the regulars raised their glasses. "To Kevin," someone said, then quieter, "and to the truth, whatever it is." Because the truth in New Haven had become a slippery thing, something that lived between science and instinct, grief and guilt, love and violence. Allison Davis was free, but freedom doesn't erase suspicion. Even now, when the lights go out in that house on the corner, neighbors say they can still see a shadow standing at the window. Not a ghost, just a reminder. The reminder that justice, like love, doesn't always fall cleanly. Sometimes it tumbles down the stairs. If you thought this story was over, think again. Because 3 months later, another 911 call came in from the same street. Another fall, another victim. But that's a story for the next video. Subscribe before the next truth disappears.